Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guests today are Dr. Michael Poliakoff and Armand Alacbay from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or Acta as it's known. Dr. Poliakoff is the president of Acta, and he's had a long and distinguished career in education. He became part of the Acta team in March 2010 as its vice president of policy and became its third president in 2016. Prior to Acta, he served as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Research at the University of Colorado and at senior roles at the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Council on Teacher Quality, the American Academy for Liberal Education, and the Pennsylvania Department of Education. Armand Alacbay is Acta's Vice President for Trustee and Government Affairs. A lawyer by education and practice, he's been with Acta for 10 years, where he oversees their external affairs team to promote public policy objectives at the federal, state, and institutional levels. Prior to Acta, he worked in private practice as a trial attorney and later managed an educational services startup company. He's a whiz at research, and his most recent publication for Acta is entitled The Cost of Excess: Why Colleges and Universities Must Control Runaway Spending, which will be the subject of our talk today. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Drumm, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, I thank you, and I am looking forward to this. Y'all there at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni just published a new report called The Cost of Excess. And before we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is Acta.
I'm delighted to give some background about that. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or Acta for short, was founded 26 years ago. At that point, our founding president was concerned about the direction that higher education was taking. He was concerned about slipping academic standards, about erosion of free expression on campus, about the escalation of tuition. And we take no pleasure 26 years later in saying, "We told you so." We don't want to be thermometers that just tell us how uncomfortable we've gotten. We want to be thermostats that actually can help to change the temperature for the better. And we focus on what we call the 3 A's: academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability. And it's particularly that last category that brings us here together today. The report that Armand and his team put together is a crucial document to help higher education leaders take stock of where they are going, not just to be aware of the crushing increase in tuition and often the misplaced priorities in how scarce higher education funds are used, but to be able to take real focused action to turn things around.
And I think that's incredibly important, especially as you say 26 years ago, you were talking about the same problems that we have. I've said for a long time that a crisis does not bring up new problems. It just highlights problems in a greater way that we currently have. And I think that's what we've seen with COVID. Now, let's just clarify real quick political leanings. Acta, as my understanding, is pretty much independent. You don't cater to conservative. You don't cater to liberal. It's a very independent thinking. Am I correct?
That's exactly right. We pride ourselves on being nonpartisan. We are not a membership organization, which means that we are not beholden to any institution. We try to the best of our ability to interpret the trends, whether on the micro level or on the macro level, and give good guidance in accordance. As one of our directors once said, "Oh, Michael, tell me, what's political about wanting every college student to have a math class?" And I've always taken that to heart, that we are, to a certain degree, traditional in that we think that there should be a strong general education for all students that will prepare them for citizenship, prepare them for a meaningful career and for community. But that's not a partisan issue. That's an educational quality issue.
Well, and that's one of the beautiful things about the American higher education system, is that it's not a system. It's a patchwork of independent, unique, diverse institutions, both public and private. And so our lane, so to speak, at Acta has always been improving informed institutional governance. I mean, we feel that a lot of the most transformational change in higher ed will happen at the institutional level, and that's independent of anything political.
And I know there's a lot of Republicans who would love to hear that because they want to do away with the Department of Education. But that's a whole different story for another day. Armand, why did you guys decide to do this report? I mean, this is the whole report, the title of it, The Cost of Excess, is one of those things like, okay, we have a problem. We know that the student debt is just runaway. The tuition, the discount rates have all gotten significantly higher. Why this report and why now?
So this report is under what Acta calls the Project on Administrative Costs, and it gets at a long-term trend and then what we have going forward. So the near tripling of tuition of public institutions over the past 30 years, and that's inflation adjusted. And then at $1.7 trillion in student debt. At some point, there's a problem here. And so the question is, what is the role of institutions, institutional leadership in curbing this problem? And you look at that in terms of today. You have COVID, you have a fragile economic environment, and not only that, but future demographic trends that aren't looking good. I think it's a 15% drop in freshman prospects starting in 2025. So there are a lot of things that are factoring into play. And what we were really trying to do is find, how do we quantify the effect of all of this institutional spending on affordability, and does it benefit students?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the critical question is, does all this extra spending help students? Does it help graduation rates? Does it help them prepare for their careers? Michael, this is not the first report that you guys have done, is it?
No, hardly. We do try to put out a pretty robust stream of essays, publications for the benefit particularly of college and university trustees. I can say from my own experience in working with boards that very often there is a mindset that is simply to say, this is the way we do things here. And one of Acta's key roles is to say, there are some best practices as well as some worst practices that we can learn to avoid. And these are things that you need to know in addition to having fine-grained information on the operations of your institution so that you can be a meaningful, engaged policymaker. It's important to look beyond, to look especially at those outliers who, like Mitch Daniels at Purdue, can keep tuition frozen for 10 years while doing many ambitious academic projects, or like Michael Crow at Arizona State University, whose recombination of departments has saved the school probably around $13 million recurring every year without terminating a single faculty member. These are the models that are so very important. And we see it as one of our main duties to get that information out and to challenge boards of trustees to be highly informed and highly engaged fiduciaries.
Well, not just to challenge them, but to empower them as well. So a couple of years ago, we created a website called How Colleges Spend Money. It's at howcollegesspendmoney.com. And there we have about 1,500 colleges and universities, data from the Department of Education, every Title IV participating institution, four-year public and private institutions, where any board member, any member of the public can look up any institution, what it spends on administration per student, what it spends on instruction per student, soon student services per student, but more importantly, benchmark that against peers. And by peers, I mean the peers that the institution itself selected as comparison points.
That would be great information for every board member to have of every institution. Armand, would you repeat that website one more time, please?
That's howcollegesspendmoney.com.
Howcollegesspendmoney.com. And oh my gosh, people are going to, that's going to open a lot of folks' eyes, especially with the benchmarking stuff. Let's get into the actual report and spend a few minutes on that. As I read through the report, there were a lot of jaw-dropping moments there. But you had three high-level findings, really, and let's talk about each of those and maybe dig down a little bit. The first, spending at institutions of higher education continued to climb both during and after the Great Recession.
Right. So we looked at data immediately after the Great Recession up until 2018, which is the most recent data available at the time. And the question was was spending going up during that time? And the answer is yes. And generally speaking, that spending was going towards non-instructional services. So student services and administration, more so than instructional spending. Now, even though instructional spending does take up generally a much larger share of the budget, student services and administration are closing the gap, so to speak. That's really going more toward, the trend seems to be going more toward more expensive administrative staff as opposed to instructional staff.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I read was, from 2012 to 2018, the colleges, university prioritized hiring of less expensive and often less credential instructional staff, i.e., relying far more on adjunct professors rather than tenured or full-time professors.
Right. And I think that speaks just to the nature of the type of spending in each of these categories. Not all instructional expenditure is alike. Mm-hmm. And as we get to later in this report, explain part of the reason why we've hit a level of diminishing returns with even instructional expenditure, which is in theory a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, too, student services. How do you find student services? Like right now, there is a huge emphasis on providing student mental health counseling, things like that. Is that what you're talking about? Is that part of that category, or is it something else?
Well, it's everything that the Department of Education classifies as student services, which includes student mental health, or anything that aids in the student experience, student activities. Things like the registrar's office could fall in there. So it's a wide variety of different expenditures.
Mm-hmm. Is that come because of increased regulation?
In part, maybe, I guess is the short answer. So what we looked at, though, is, well, to what extent does this contribute to, the spending contribute to tuition? How much is college affordable? And also to how much does it benefit students in terms of graduation rates? And one of the most interesting things was that at public institutions, we found no statistical correlation between student services spending and improving graduation rates.
Wow.
So whatever goes into there, at least in the aggregate, there seems to be no relation. I mean, and that just, it's considering that, at least during the time period we looked at, schools spent about $112 billion in this one category alone. It's a sobering finding.
Mm-hmm. Michael, thoughts?
We recognize that there have been major changes in the student population. I by the way, am still teaching. I teach one course a semester in the evening at George Mason University, which I love doing, and it's also important for me because it puts me in touch with the modern classroom. And many of my students have very complex lives. We're not saying that every expenditure in student services is an unnecessary expenditure that is not bringing some quality to campus life. But economics is the grim science. And we've got to recognize that we have to make hard choices. I found it just one of those coincidences. A couple days ago in the New York Times, there was an article that was expressing deep concern about the decline in African American enrollment at a number of leading Southern universities. The author was a graduate of Auburn. And let me just read these lines. I put this in front of me for today's interview. One possible explanation for the sinking numbers of Black students at these institutions is that tuition shot up significantly at many colleges during and after the 2008 financial crisis to compensate for the substantial declines in state funding per student. Now, Armand's work disaggregates these categories of expenditure in a regression analysis and shows that, in fact, spending continued to rise during this period of declining state support. But the point that I wanted to make now is that when an institution increases its expenditure, the consequence will be rising tuition. And the one quality measure that we used, which is graduation rates, will not show that money has had a good return on investment. And in fact, what we find in terms of diversity, it will have a damaging effect. So that's the wake-up call that every board member needs to heed. This information is macro level, it's aggregate, but what is the fine-grained decision-making that needs to take place on campus?
Mm-hmm. Put another way, when we looked at the spending increases since the Great Recession, we controlled for the level of state appropriations. So spending increased, tuition increased, and even state support decreased, but even controlling for that, the average, again, this is in the aggregate, the average public institution in our study still increased spending on administration on an annual basis $49 a year and passed off $19 a year onto tuition solely because of the choice to increase spending. That's independent of state appropriations or any other factor.
So it's the spending, and in fact, I think one of the things that you postulate is it's wasteful spending that has driven up, and wasteful spending defined as, is it going to impact your graduation rates? You know, it's spending has driven up the tuition, and it's putting it out of reach for many Black Americans and other minorities to where they can no longer afford a college education.
I think, it's a matter of, have we hit diminishing returns on some of the expenditures? I mean, no one questions that a college education is, on the whole, a very expensive proposition. And then the question is, at what point does it become too expensive to be worth it, or how much? At what point have we spent too much in this area? And so, take the average private institution in our study, a modest 2% increase in instructional expenditure brings your tuition up about another $213 per student for every student. And the benefit is 6 additional students graduating. Again, is it worth the trade-off? It's an honest question I think institutional leaders need to ask is, where's the balance here?
Sure.
And perhaps we can even make that a little bit more dramatic when we think about building the fancy buildings and how often that will go into mandatory fees for future years, future classes, often going out 10, 15 years. The Society for College and University Planning did a series of reports on the building boom. I remember once the Chronicle quoting a Boston architect saying that the space per student has in some cases tripled since the 1970s. Colleges have been prodigal. Does that fancy building do the kind of good that we want on campus? Or is it in fact a liability that will keep many students away? It's very exciting to cut the ribbon, but even if there's a fair amount of donor support for it, the maintenance costs may be commensurate with the building costs, and it will be, you might say, the gift that keeps on taking. And In terms of student services, it could be populated with all kinds of staff to help, make sure that the building experience is a good one, especially if it's a recreational building. Is it worth it? I'll add one other point. We interviewed Brandon Bastide from Kaplan right at the beginning of the pandemic, and he, in his wonderfully incisive way, compared tuition at Imperial College London with tuition at his alma mater, which is Duke. Imperial College London at that point was rated 9th in the world, and international tuition would have been about $30,000 a year. How long is it going to take before at least the international crowd begins to question whether American higher education is still the envy of the world? I want it to be the envy of the world forever, but it's not going to get there by maintaining the status quo that we see.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I took a look at and really gave me a moment to pause is on the percentage basis in your report, the increase of instructional spending at public institutions twice as effective as an increase in administrative spending in improving graduation rates. So it's putting money into instructional design, faculty members, the things that really improve a student's education. That's what improves your graduation rates.
Which is the opposite of the trend we're actually seeing since the Great Recession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of the Great Recession, your report ended in 2018. You've gotten a little bit more data, especially in the COVID. Any preliminary thoughts on that? Because I think that's going to be impactful.
So we have 2 more years of data. We're up to 2020, as I think the 2020 data just came out from the department just recently, maybe a few weeks ago. But what's interesting about that is that will be really the beginning of the COVID era, depending on kind of how the fiscal years shake out with reporting. What we're hoping to see is a different story from the Great Recession, but nothing yet as far as a full report. What we will have is we'll be adding that data to our website, howcollegesspendmoney.com, so institutions can see for themselves how they've done since the Great Recession up until now, and how that reflects against their benchmark peers.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think all of us hope that the infusion of federal funding will not be an opiate that will encourage institutions not to reckon with themselves and not to recognize that what Clayton Christensen predicted years ago is still a very, very real warning, and that many wonderful institutions that contribute to the diversity of American higher education and its institutions could well tank if they don't heed the wake-up call of demography, of cost, and prioritization of the things that they need to do for student success.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. For years, for actually probably about 2 to 3 years now, I have been preaching, for lack of a better word, about how higher ed is in a mature to declining market. I mean, there's very little differentiation, cost cutting, increasing prices. The one anomaly with that is the price of education continues to go up. And I think a lot of it has to do with just what you're saying is wasteful spending. And so there are some great examples out there with respect to who are doing it right. Michael, you mentioned Purdue, you've mentioned ASU, University of Maryland system is also doing a really good job, are they not?
Their accountability report, help me, Armand, what's the name of that?
It's the Effectiveness and Efficiency Initiative.
Yes, thank you, Effectiveness and Efficiency. That has done the system a lot of good, and University of Maryland's quality indicators are very high, which shows that you can be efficient and effective at the same time.
And sometimes it takes tough decisions, tough choices. I think part of that initiative, I think they saved $500 million overall, but part of that included increasing teaching loads by 10% at research institutions, which, I mean, it's a major sacrifice, but again, sometimes they do have to be made.
There are in front of us really good solutions that have been implemented. Brigham Young, Idaho, under President Henry Eyring, was not in a strong position until it became a 12-month per year campus. And with the cooperation of the faculty, with obviously increased compensation, it has really increased its ability to serve students, to get more in, and obviously that brings more revenue. I did a little calculation once of the UC system, apropos of what Armand said about what Maryland did. The maximum teaching load within the University of California universities for tenure track faculty is 4 courses, the equivalent of 4 courses per year. Some of them are on a quarter system. And I speak as somebody who has been a tenured professor. That's a really, really light load. Now, there are about 9,000 of those. If you increased the teaching load by 10%, which would be at most 1 more course every other year, that would be the equivalent of having 900 more faculty members. And if you combine that with the underutilization of classroom space at those universities, something we can go into in a moment, you would be increasing the revenue stream, and most important, you would be giving opportunities to students who otherwise would not have them. That's simply a leadership issue. It's a question of will. And these things can be done. We regularly track classroom utilization, and the findings are shocking. How often institutions don't get anywhere near the state guidelines for the use of these expensive buildings. And I add environmentally destructive buildings when you tear them down and build new ones. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you stop and think a building, you build this wonderful new building, all the technology, which the technology is going to be obsolete in 5 to 10 years. The building actually stays empty for probably 4 to 6 months of the year during summer term or breaks or whatnot. And the classrooms themselves, are each of the classrooms filled up on a daily basis? And the answer to that is no. So why are you spending literally millions of dollars to build new edifications to a particular donor? That money that is spent to build, you're going to end up spending probably 20 to 40% more than the cost of the building for maintenance over its lifetime.
And I'll add one other factor, which is that it is corrupting for buildings to stay idle as they do on Friday afternoons and at the 8 a.m. slot across the week. Is this the way to train the people who are going to be part of the American economy in the future? It follows like the night to day. If there are no academic requirements on Friday, the party will start on Thursday night, and it will just get more and more exuberant and wild over the weekend. I'm not dour, I'm not austere, but this is not the way one habituates the citizenry and the workforce of the future.
No, I did a podcast with Kim Hadley from John Brown University. She has been in higher ed for many years, but she's also been a CFO, different companies, etc., as well as higher ed. And they did some really unique things. Because of COVID, they moved up their fall terms. They ended it early. They did a January term. They pushed back their normal spring start by a bit of time, and they end up doing 2 terms in the summer. I mean, when you take a look at that, that's a much better building utilization. It helps the students because they can take courses, intense of course, but they can take more courses to get them to graduation more quickly, which costs less money, which less impact on the student debt, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, why aren't more institutions thinking about things like this other than the, quote, traditional way of doing it? Armand.
So what is it about necessity is the mother of invention? And I think part of the reason why colleges and universities have been insulated from all these economic downturns in the past has been because you've had this influx of new students coming in during those downturns. The problem is you don't have that future going forward, right? You see the decrease in the freshman population in the coming years, and so there is a looming necessity coming up. So if it hasn't happened before, I think those solutions are going to, by necessity, come out very soon.
Mm-hmm. And so that brings us to a really good question, something I like to ask all of my guests is, this is great information. What do boards, what do presidents need to do about it?
Let me start with a couple of big picture things. And I'll even tell you about a sort of searing moment right after I came to Acta. I got a call from the board chair of an institution that will remain unnamed, and he said, is it normal to get the budget the day of the meeting when we're supposed to approve it? I said, no. And I think that's probably an outlier, but
no,
it was a reminder that board members who are wonderful people who are giving of their time, they're not paid, need to be, when necessary, aggressive in saying they cannot be fiduciaries without the information, without the data that they need. And one of the reasons that I am in such admiration of my colleague Armand is that he is so, to use his term, empowered boards. A few keystrokes will enable anybody, board member or member of the public, to see how is our institution doing relative to other institutions. One can pull up that bar graph, the ratio of administrative to instructional expenditure, and then to ask those questions at a board meeting. One bad habit of board members is to fear the press. I'm not encouraging them to leak in any way, shape, or form, but to fear a split vote because it wouldn't look good is not the way they should behave, any more so than the Supreme Court should fear a split vote. Everybody has to act on his or her conscience and to be brave and to be bold, to ask the hard questions. This is not saying that they should be disruptors, but they are in charge. They are responsible for everything that happens: academic quality, freedom of expression, fiscal responsibility, and not to wait until they read things in the school newspaper, but to be proactive.
Mm-hmm. The three fiduciary sisters: duty of care,
yes,
duty of loyalty, duty of obedience.
Yes.
There's a saying we actually use at Acta that trustees should be receptive to all but beholden to none.
I like that.
And really, I mean, they are they're fiduciaries, and the one constituency that has the legal duty to look after the public interest. It's a nonprofit enterprise. Are we meeting our mission? Are we meeting our core mission? Are we doing right? Not just the people that we're immediately dealing with, but future graduates. Are we doing employers right? These are all the big picture issues that factor into these things.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a moment when the CFO said to the board, you had the courage to raise tuition. And of course they applauded. And that's another one of those moments burned into my memory, because we're now seeing the effect of this. It was popular to say that college tuition is good debt. We know that's not true. It was terribly misleading. For some students who have made a wise investment in a particular professional degree, perhaps, but that's not a justification for the escalation that we have seen over the past few decades. And every trustee needs to have that burned into his or her heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things, and it in some ways it kind of bothers me. It's really great that people want to donate their time and they're willing to donate their time to sit on the boards of universities. But frankly, I would like to see some sort of compensation so you get more professional trustees on board. Right now, the compensation goes the other way. Either you make a donation to a political campaign to get on a public university board, or a donation to the university to get on the private university's board. We need to change that around so that we get people who are truly engaged. And I'm not saying that trustees are not engaged, but how many of them have the time to put in to be a functioning and an elite board member at an institution?
Right, exactly right. And certainly one of our directors at Acta has developed a matrix that we will be sharing of the particular skills and knowledge that a board should have, so that selection is not just driven by the checkbook or public relations, but by the necessity of having people who understand auditing, who understand finance, who understand professional schools, so that they can be informed fiduciaries who are willing to probe and ask and to stay on the trail until things are as good as they could be.
And I think one important part of what you just said, Michael, is that it's the skills that a board needs. It's not an individual trustee. There's no individual that possesses all of the various skills, experiences, etc., that are vital to an active, engaged, functioning board. Really need to look at board governance as a holistic exercise. And that goes not just for privates, but for public institutions as well. You know, governors who are appointing trustees to a board, it should never be a partisan exercise. It should be looking at what are the needs of that governing board of the institution. What are the skills that are required? You know, where are the holes there? You know, what's for the best functioning of the board.
Mm-hmm. The board should be able to be a consultant on nearly every topic that administration brings to them. Not only should they be decision makers, but they should be an extra consultant to administration. And without those broad, I call it a skills matrix, without those broad skills that are looked at not only from a skills perspective, but from a board turnover perspective to make sure that you have the right skills at any given time. It's a critical function of the nominations and governance committee of a board. And most higher ed boards don't have a nom-gov committee. They may have a nominations that fall to the executive committee, but that's usually the extent of it.
When one thinks of some of the real cost drivers like buildings, there are a few steps that ought to be part of the protocol. How about a report on utilization of existing buildings 5 days a week, if not 7 days a week, from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., before we even talk about whether we're going to break ground, before we start going down that road? That's not hard. It takes a certain level of candor and honesty. Real review of how courses are done, how programs are added. I did a report some years ago with the late Betty Capaldi Phillips from Arizona State University, a brilliant administrator, alas, now no longer with us. But what we found was that there are institutions that have over 3,000 different choices for the general education requirements. And typically, a great number of those courses will be under-enrolled. So we present students with a vast cafeteria line of choices. Many of these students are ill-equipped to make wise choices, and the school is paying a huge amount in salaries to maintain these rather than having a much more disciplined and focused and efficient group of foundational requirements.
Yeah, very much so. And unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. And so, gentlemen, 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards.
Well, I think everything has to flow from the institutional mission. And so, Acta, we do board retreats every now and again with trustees across the country. And pretty much we start every one of those with looking at the institutional mission. And pretty much every institutional mission has some form of preparing graduates for a career in community. And so, what does that mean? Well, at the very least, it's getting them to graduate, right? That's the key word in there. So I would say one would be to be laser focused on the mission in particular, graduation rates and preparation, not just getting them to graduate, but also to make sure those are meaningful degrees with substantive, meaningful requirements for graduation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great one. Thank you. Michael.
And I would add this one, which is bouncing it right back to my colleague. We use the phrase data-driven decision-making, but that depends on the data and having good data. And I am so glad that Armand's team did this report, because it really puts the onus back on every board, every fiduciary, to say, look, the aggregate picture is frightening for the nation. Are we any different? Are we part of the problem? Mm-hmm. And to start framing policy on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess kind of lastly, all of this trusteeship and governance, it's not just an exercise in good accounting, right? It's about meaningful service. And I would say that this whole idea of looking at institutional spending is really looking at what role you as a board play in this global economy. I mean, student debt is at a tipping point right now. And it's something that affects generations, multiple generations of people in the choices that they make. So these decisions in the college board are not in a vacuum. They affect everyone, employers, alumni, the state at large. So yeah, I mean, it's a very serious endeavor.
Yeah, certainly is.
I was going to ask if I could add just one more small point.
Oh, please.
Which is, when we look at the OECD charts, what we notice is that between private and public funding, America just about leads the world. Luxembourg spends more per student in tertiary education than we do. But effectively, we are so far beyond the average expenditure that we're off the charts. And yet, in those international studies of core collegiate skills, we're a little bit below average. When we look at the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, we do not look good. And so that's another place where college leadership has to be asking itself, well, maybe we're doing really well on tech transfer or on research spending. Are we doing well in serving our students so that they really are ready for the challenges ahead?
Mm-hmm. And so, gentlemen, what's next for Acta?
What's next for Acta? Let me go back to Armand, because I know he's got some great ideas for the project on administrative cost.
Well, one of them really is just digging deeper into this whole notion of student service spending. I mean, it is a mixed bag of items, but the one thing that really sticks out from our study is that the fact that there is no correlation with outcomes, or at least as far as graduation rates. It's an issue that really warrants further study. Another issue, though, is also one of the limitations of any of these studies is the proxy for success. And so classically, we've always looked at graduation rates. I mean, graduation rates are pretty dismal across the country anyway, but there are also other ones. I mean, the value-added assessment. So there are nationally normed measures of value-added assessment, student outcomes like the collegiate learning assessment, et cetera, that look at the delta, the difference between year one and graduation in terms of actual learning gains. Is that a better proxy for student outcomes? How does spending affect that? These are really questions that get at where's all this going, right? We know that it's making things more expensive. Are there any ways to figure out what the ideal levels are?
Yeah. And what's the silver bullet that will help make students better prepared, get them to graduate more quickly, and help them become lifelong learners? Because as quickly as technology changes in our society, and I mean, Moore's Law is a great example. No one expected that to hold true, but here it is, 40 years later, and it certainly has. How do we prepare students? How do we prepare graduates to stay up with this increasing level of technology and still be able to enjoy productive lives, have their family if this is what they want to do, and really be able to enjoy life? So, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast. I've had a lot of fun and learned a lot, and I hope our audience has as well.
Drumm, it's been a real privilege to be with you. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to today's special guest, Dr. Michael Poliakoff and Armand Alacbay of Acta, and for a great discussion on the cost of excess, the report they just recently published. Our next guest is Tom Netting, who we welcome back to talk to us about the most recent updates in Washington. There's a lot going on there, especially with the Biden administration policies that are getting pushed through Congress, and he'll be here to give us an update on all that's going on.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.